going to say I think we should have a policy of always having Dr. Vetter speak right after lunch. There's absolutely no possibility that anyone gets drowsy or so now you're all hopped up for this less invigorating lecture on time preference and interest. Up to this point, then, we've talked about ends and means. We've talked about the causal laws that relate ends and means and the structure of production and so on. We've talked about the laws of valuation and appraisement by which all of the factors of production are allocated to their highest valued uses and the manner in which the capital structure is built up over time. In this lecture, what we want to do is focus on time itself, then, as a part of human action. And the first point we might make about time is one that we won't pursue in this lecture. It strays outside of the subject matter of time preference per se. But we might just recognize the immediate and rather obvious fact that in every action, means are applied in striving to attain for an end in the future. Since action can't be instantaneous, but all actions take some time, we must anticipate the realization of our end only in the future. This then implies that in every action, people face uncertainty. We don't know perfectly in advance whether or not the application of our means will in fact realize our end. And the existence of uncertainty in action, that we can't perfectly know in advance that our ends will be satisfied when we act, also implies that since we do act in the face of uncertainty, that we must have some human skill of dealing with uncertainty. We must be able to somehow accommodate or cope with uncertainty. And it's that skill that we call entrepreneurship. And so later in the week, when we talk about entrepreneurship itself is bound up with the very fact that action takes place in time. And thus we face uncertainty. And in action we deal with this, we forecast in the face of these uncertain realizations of our ends. But as I said, we won't talk about entrepreneurship per se anymore. Now, in thinking, though, about the time element in action, we can break the element of time in action into different categories. So when we're thinking about how time is related to the application of means to attain our ends, we realize that there's something that we might call the period of production. So the period of production is the time from the beginning of an action until the realization of an end. So this we call the period of production. This period of production can be further divided into what we might call working time, which is a time when we're acting. We're actively involved in the pursuit of the end. This would include then all the stages of production that we spoke about before. So the working time involved in producing a Honda Civic might be a year, from the beginning of mining iron until we eventually get the car. But in addition to working time, there might also be maturing time. Maturing time then would be the time it takes between an action that is designed to attain the end and the actual attainment of the end. Maybe that we act and we achieve something, let's say the existence of a good, that has to ripen or mature before the end itself can be attained. The obvious example would be a wine. Right? So we produce a bottle of wine, but then we don't act towards it anymore. We just set it aside and it matures until the time at which the end is achieved. Now another category of time would be the duration of serviceableness of the good that we produce. So the duration of serviceableness is the time over which a good generates its services. We referred to this before as durability of a good. So in each instance, when we have a good produced, there will be from this good a duration of serviceableness. And this too is an element of our action. We need to know this or be able to estimate it when we engage in action. Now, just to reiterate then, these two time periods, the period of production and the duration of serviceableness, are necessary categories of acting. We're not saying that these are somehow historical categories by which we comprehend action in the past. It may be, of course, that we can apply these to past actions. But really, they're more than that. It's necessary for us to comprehend that these categories, in fact, exist before we can act towards an end at all. Say, okay, how long will it take me to engage in the production process? How long will the good that I produce generate services? If I can't anticipate these two time elements involved in my action, then I can't economize my action. I can't anticipate the value and the cost of my action. Okay, then finally there's a period of provision. It's also a necessary part of acting. And the period of provision is the time over which a person, in his action, provides for the future. Okay, so in every action, since we're aiming at the attainment of an end in the future, we're providing for some future end, in other words. All of our action incorporates this idea of a period of provision, over which, by acting, we'll satisfy an end. Okay, now the main concept that we want to talk about in this lecture is time preference. It's one thing to categorize different time elements involved in action, but time preference gets to the main issue, which is the valuation of time periods. So we define time preference this way. We say time preference is the preference to satisfy an end sooner in time as opposed to the same satisfaction later in time. So a satisfaction is we always have a preference to attain a satisfaction sooner in time as opposed to the same satisfaction later in time. Now, if time preference did not exist, if we presuppose that humans had no time preference and thus paid no heed to sooner or later in time, but treated them as equivalent, not preferring sooner, then of course it would logically follow that we would act in ways that we in fact do not act. For example, if this were the case, we would always choose, when we wanted to act toward something, we would always choose the most productive process possible. Right? No matter how long the process took, we would always choose to do it in the most productive way. Why is this so? Because we prefer more to less, right? We prefer more of the good to less of the good. Let's say we have Robinson Crusoe again who wants to make a net and catch fish on his island. Well, if he had no time preference, where it didn't matter to him that he preferred to have the fish sooner as opposed to later, then of course he would begin on a production process that was most productive in making the net or in catching the fish, whatever that process might happen to be. He would try, for example, he might try to build a machine by which he could produce nets like on an assembly line in mass. Well, maybe it would take him a long time to do this. Maybe it would take decades for him to construct such a thing. It would be like the old Gilligan Island, right? Where you sort of construct these massive pulley and wheel mechanisms by which you churn out goods. But no, this is not how he acts, right? He acts in a way that takes account of sooner versus later. And all of us do this in our actions. Also, it would be another anomaly that would occur if it were true that we didn't pay attention to sooner or later, would be we would never say that a goal is too remote to aim at. If we didn't care that we could achieve our end sooner or later, if this was irrelevant to us, then we would never say that attainment of an end is beyond our reach because it's too far in the future. We wouldn't care if we had to wait 10 years to attain an end or 50 years. Or to put it differently in terms that we described before, we would have infinite periods of provision if we had no time preference. Now, clearly, infinite periods of provision are ruled out by the very fact of action. The very fact that we act means that our periods of provision are not infinite. If they were, of course, we would always delay action into the future to attain this more remote, but more valuable good. We can look at time preference in a slightly different way. Time preference means that when we act in a consumptive way, when we take a good and we consume it in the present, or we use it for consumption purposes, that we do this because we prefer the satisfaction of the end sooner as opposed to later. So the very fact of present consumption demonstrates time preference. That is to say, what if we assume that we don't have time preference? That we don't make a distinction between sooner or later? Or that we, in fact, prefer the future satisfaction to the present? Well, then we would never consume in the present. If we always preferred the future, we would never consume in the present, right? If I preferred to eat my ham sandwich tomorrow instead of today, then when tomorrow comes, I'd prefer to consume it the next day. So I would never consume. So the mere fact that we engage in present consumption demonstrates time preference. It demonstrates the fact that we prefer an end satisfied in the present as opposed to the future. Now, time preference, like preference itself, is a praxeological concept. As we've been discussing, it's a concept that's inherent, it's implied by the very fact that we act. The very fact that we act in the present demonstrates that we prefer sooner as opposed to later. That we do not have infinite time horizons. This concept of time preference then is not psychological. Just like preference itself is not a psychological concept in economics. In other words, we're not saying that time preference is something like impatience or the disutility of waiting or something like this. We're not denying that people can be impatient or have disutility of waiting. That's just not what we mean by time preference. Time preference is the universal preference that we have for sooner as opposed to later satisfactions of our end. It doesn't matter whether we're impatient or not, or whether we have disutility of waiting, or whether we like to sit around and wait. Also, time preference is not a physiological concept. It doesn't depend upon the fact that in order to live, we have to satisfy certain physiological needs. Consumption needs are necessary to sustain life. Quite obviously, for most of us, these basic physiological needs are all met. And yet we still have time preference, right? We have time preference regardless of whether our physiological needs are met or not. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It's, again, a logical concept involved in the fact that we act in the present. Now, another aspect of time preference at this introductory level is that it's important to keep in mind that time preference always refers to sooner and later in time. It doesn't refer to more or less time involved in an action. It refers to only the concept that sooner is better than later for the satisfaction of a given end. Why is this so? Well, as Mises puts it, time is an irreversible flux. Right? Time just passes by. We can't own it. It is not a factor of production that we own or allocate. We don't allocate time. Time simply is an irreversible flux. It just goes on from moment to moment. And so it's not possible for us to order our actions using more or less time. This is not the proper way of thinking about time. The proper way of thinking about time, since it just continues on, is sooner or later in time. The reason this is important, and I'll get to this in more detail later, is that some economists argue to the contrary, that time is just a factor of production. Time can be treated like any other factor of production. It has a rental price like wages for labor or rents for land and so on. But this seems to be precluded by the very nature of what time is. Time is not personal property. You have ownership over it. You can't allocate it. All you can do is decide to attain an end either sooner in time or later in time. You can strive to it by engaging in more roundabout production processes, extending the time frame, or shorter production processes where your end is achieved sooner in time. Now, there also, in talking about time preference, we would notice one empirical fact about reality. And this is that goods with the shortest periods of production do not satisfy all of our ends. So we can take actions that have the very shortest periods of production possible. Picking berries off trees, catching fish with our hands in a stream, so on and so forth. These would be extremely short production periods. There would not be much of a structure of production to them. Production processes like this do not satisfy all of our ends. Now, our world could be constructed in such a way that they did, but it isn't. In order for us to have other things, other more valuable goods that we desire, or more of the goods that we can attain with shorter production processes, we need lengthier production processes. We need production processes that take more steps. You can't make an automobile in one step. If you want something like this, you have to go through many steps. And these stages of production take time. This is a lengthier production process. So to have an end like that satisfied, we can only do so with lengthier production processes. But lengthier production processes already have one strike against them, right? The longer the production process is, the less desirable it is. Because we have to go through this period of extending the satisfaction of our end into the future, which is what time preference contradicts. We don't wish to do this. We wish to have the satisfaction of our end nearer to us in time. So time preference implies, given that shorter production processes don't satisfy all of our ends, that longer production processes that we undertake must render to us more valuable goods in the future. We would never undertake a lengthy production process that gives us the same output as we can get with a shorter one. We would never intentionally do this. An entrepreneurial mistake, maybe, but never intentionally. Now, there are two ways in which this could be done. There are two ways in which a longer production process could give us more valuable future goods than a shorter one. One is that the lengthier production process could give us more of the goods that we could get with a shorter production process. This is Caruso again trying to catch fish with his hands in a stream. That's a very short production process. Or taking a week or 2 weeks to make a net and then using the net to catch the fish. He does this because he thinks he can get more fish with a net. He's getting more of the good that he can produce with the shorter production process. And so he engages in the lengthier process. The second way would be the lengthier process may permit us to acquire goods in the future that we cannot produce with shorter production processes. As I mentioned before, something like an automobile, a computer, and so on and so forth. So only with lengthier production processes is it possible for us to have some of these goods. And if these goods are more valuable to us than the goods we surrender in the production of shorter production processes, this would justify the longer process. Now, we also know, or we can infer from this discussion, that at any given point in time, all of the shortest, most productive processes have been undertaken, which leaves, for any expansion of our actions, only longer, more productive processes. So anytime we wish to expand our actions, we wish to aim at new ends or raise our standard of living by building up capital or something of this sort, it always has to be done through lengthier production processes, lengthier than the ones that are currently in place. Because the shortest, most productive processes are always the ones that we will employ first. Because of time preference. We'll never go to the lengthy ones first. We'll always adopt the shortest ones. Now, furthermore, time preference is expressed in every stage of production. Every time there's the productive act, time preference is involved in the decision about how to engage in this productive step. So it isn't just that we have time preference involved in producing an automobile from mining iron to the production of the car years later, but we have time preference in every step of production. Mining the iron, then refining the iron into steel, making the steel into a fender, and so on and so forth. In every case, time preference is exhibited. Because in every case, funding of the production process has to occur up front, allocating the factors of production into this process as opposed to another. And yet the realization of the value of the end, the sale of the good that's produced, is not accomplished until the future. And as we talked about this morning, a capitalist entrepreneur then, in engaging in production processes in the structure, is involved in lending money to the factor owners in advance of the receipt of the future revenue from the sale of the good produced. And that this, because of time preference, necessitates the discount of those present payments relative to the future marginal value products of the factors that will be realized when the good is sold. So this is the explanation that I just briefly mentioned this morning about why rental prices of factors are based on discounted marginal value products and not marginal value products. Let me reiterate one other thing. Time preference, like these concepts of time, these divisions of time, is always future-looking. We use the idea of time preference, in other words, as a part of the explanation of action itself, which is always looking to the future. We don't use time preference for historical study, or at least that's not its main use. One could perhaps do this, but the main application of the idea of time preference is to explain action, which is always looking to the future. And so all the past waiting that's been involved in building up the capital structure over the years is completely irrelevant to action today. When Honda thinks about what should I do in terms of my capital stock, my factories, and so on and so forth, over the next year, they don't care what costs were undergone to build up this capital structure in the past. It doesn't matter to them what the time preferences of the capitalists were, what interest rates they paid 10 years ago to build the plant. All that's in the past. Time preference is always looking to the future when we engage in action. So any concepts that try to envision time as, in economic theory, as being usefully understood in terms of the past is an error. This is the mistake that Mises noted in boehm-bawerk's work on the capital structure and time preference. The boehm-bawerk's work depended upon what he called the average period of production, the time involved in the average period of production. Well, clearly, this concept could only refer to the past, right? You could never have something like the average period of production for entrepreneurial expectations of the future. And time preference only refers in action to the future and not to the past. Now, let me deal with one other aspect of time preference before we go on to talking about the rate of interest. And this is alleged exceptions to time preference. So oftentimes authors will say, well, okay, that argument sounds pretty good about time preference. But it's easy to think up exceptions to time preference. And so we can disprove the existence of time preference by citing these exceptions. Now, I might at first point out that this strategy, it seems to me, fails to achieve its objective even if it could be successfully employed. And it fails to achieve its objective for the following reason. As we've spoken about, Austrian economists envision economic theory as praxeology, as a rigorous logical development of various propositions that all are traceable back to the axiom of action. Individuals act. And thus there's a necessary logical demonstration of all of these concepts as we go step by step through the process. And therefore, to show that something like time preference is false or or let's say even more generally, the concept of preference is false, one has to show a flaw in the logic. One can't simply say, well, here's an example where it doesn't seem like time preference works. This doesn't seem to be a sufficient kind of refutation. Let me make this application. Let's say somebody disagreed with our position that what's important in determining action for the individual is always preference. In every action, in other words, we always aim at what we prefer and we set aside what we prefer less. Let's say somebody tried to dispute this by coming up with counter examples. They said, well, let me try to invent one. Let's say somebody says, well, people don't really act that way. They act out of habit. They don't. Like, for example, a smoker. A smoker smokes because he's addicted, or it's an habitual thing, right? He doesn't prefer it. If you ask him whether he prefers to smoke or not, he says, no, I hate smoking. I wish I could quit. So obviously, here's an example of acting that contradicts preference. Now, what response do we give to this as Austrian economists? We say, no, this is all wrong. You're viewing the situation incorrectly. He does prefer it. Preference is simply the concept we use for the fact that he acts the way he does. You cannot act in contradistinction to your preference. Now, he may not like it. He may not think this is the best of all possible worlds. He may regret it after he does it. But he still prefers it when he does it. That's simply what we mean by preference. See, there are no counter examples to preference. So if time preference is like this, we should not expect to find counter examples. Every counter example should be simply explained by pointing out exactly what time preference means. Just saying it over and over again. Time preference is demonstrated every time we act in the present. We're always demonstrating time preference. And therefore there should be no exceptions. So anyway, let me mention a few of these. And I take these all from Human Action, from Mises. Goes through a list of these. And when he says, well, okay, here's a situation people have used in the past to try to say that time preference is no good. It's false because this is an exception. He says, a man is offered 2 concert tickets for the same evening. You get 2 concert tickets for Friday evening. You obviously can't go to them both. Right? And so you say, or the man says, who gets these 2 tickets, he says, boy, I wish one of these concert tickets was for Saturday. See, I prefer that my end could be achieved in the future. I prefer it to be Saturday, not Friday. So doesn't this contradict time preference? And Mises says, well, obviously not. Obviously what this man is doing is choosing between 2 present options, right? This is just a basic problem of establishing a preference between 2 options in the present, which is the Friday. What's he going to do Friday night? This is what we do in every action. We say, okay, I will do this on Friday night, and I won't do that on Friday night. Of course, we could always say we wish our resources weren't scarce, our means weren't scarce, so that we could enjoy everything that we wanted that we're setting aside today. We could enjoy in the future. But again, this doesn't contradict time preferences. It isn't relevant to time preference. Another example is perishable goods. A famous case here is ice in the winter and ice in the summer. So in the winter we say, I prefer to have my ice in the summer. So aren't we now preferring a future good to an identical present good? Isn't this a contradiction then of time preference? As Mises points out, no, this doesn't work either. Again, we should be predisposed against all of these sorts of examples. Why doesn't this work? Well, it doesn't work because ice in the winter and ice in the summer are different goods. As Mises points out, ice in the winter is only a complementary good to ice in the summer, right? If I want to choose between using ice that I have in the winter now or that same ice in the summer, I have to store the ice. So ice in the winter is simply a capital good that I'm storing up in order to use it as a consumer good in the future. Therefore, it's not the same good. It's simply a complementary good to ice in the summer and not the same good itself. Or we might point this out. We say the only reason it seems plausible that ice in the winter would be less preferable to ice in the summer is because ice in the winter, typically in the winter, we have a greater stock of ice. And because of diminishing marginal utility, therefore, our value of it in the present period is lower. Whereas in the summer, since we don't have much ice, at least it's not naturally available to us, the stock of it is reduced, and because of diminishing marginal utility, then we value it more highly. Well, again, this isn't what we're talking about with time preference. This is just a different situation. Now, the third one he points out is, what about a miser? You know, here's the miser, the hoarder, the infamous hoarder, as Keynes would tell us. Has this terrible psychological disposition to store up things. He never engages in present use of these things. He just stores them up, presumably intending to use them in the future. Well, Mises points out the obvious. Even a miser consumes in the present, right? Otherwise he dies. So we can say that the miser has very low time preference, so that's certainly true. But he doesn't have no time preference. Right? His time preference is just lower than ours, lower than a normal person's. Okay, now let's turn to the rate of interest. Time preference then is manifested in what we call the originary rate of interest. Rothbard calls this the pure rate of interest. So we can say that the originary rate of interest we can look at in one of two ways. Since it's expressing time preference, and time preference is a preference for sooner over later, we can view originary interest in we can view it either from the present, or we can view it by looking at the future. So originary interest, we say then, is either a premium on the present. Time preference says we value a present satisfaction more than a future satisfaction. So originary interest could be seen as a premium on the present, or it could be seen as a discount of the future. Since we prefer the present to the future, we would have to discount the future to make it equivalent to the present. Okay, so either way of viewing it is equivalent. And let me just demonstrate that with a preference rank. And on the preference rank, I'm going to have an entry right here, so leave a little bit of space. So let's say time preference means that if we have $1,000 today, this has to be preferred to $1,000 in 1 year. Okay, a good today, a present good consumed today is worth more than the same good in the future applied to an end. So this is what time preference implies. That this ranking would always be like this. But you notice that what is not implied by this fact is whether or not there's a larger sum of money in 1 year that would be preferred. We know that $1,000 today is always preferred to $1,000 in a year, but what about $1,100 in a year? What about $1,200 or $1,250 in 1 year? Maybe $1,250 in 1 year would be preferred to $1,000 today. There might be, we can assuredly say that there will be some amount of future money, except under extraordinary circumstances, that would be preferred to a given sum in the present. And we say then that the difference between these two sums is the premium of the present. Right? So we have a $250 premium in this example, or a pure originary rate of interest of 25%. Okay, the future sum has to be 25% higher than the present sum for the person to prefer the future sum to the present. So this is how the premium is manifested. If we have time preference, which says that the present is always worth more than the future, this would always be manifested in any instance where we're able to exchange present money for future money, or a present good for a future good. Then we would discount the future good to make it equivalent to the present good, or we would add a premium to the present good to make it equivalent, so to speak, or to make the future sum preferable. So once again, we can view time preferences in either fashion. More strictly speaking, just to add the technical part of this, we could say that the future value, the future sum of money, is equivalent to the present sum of money with this premium. right? This is how we do compound interest, right? The very simple application of this principle of interest. And so in our example, then we get the future sum, the $1,250, is found by taking the present sum and multiplying by the compounding factor. This is what we mean by a premium of the present. But you'll notice that the formula has to work in reverse too, right? If the $250 is a premium of the present, then the $250 also has to be a discount of the future. If we were to receive $1,250 in 1 year, what would we pay to get that future sum today? What's the present value of the future sum? Well, it has to be $1,000. We know that just by algebraically rearranging the formula. So it's the 1250 divided now by the 1.25 for the 1,000. Okay, so once again, we see that we can view time, the manifestation of time preference in either way. And of course, in the market where we have this manifestation of time preference, we'll talk about how this happens in the market in a minute. These are equivalent, right? These are equivalent statements. I can take $1,000 and put it on interest at 25%. I'll have $1,250 at the end of the year. Or if I'm to receive $1,250 at the end of a year, I'd be willing to contract to be paid $1,000 today. The credit market, so to speak, makes these equivalent. So let's move on then to the relationship between time preference and the market rate of interest. We see that time preference now is the basis for the rate of interest. It creates, in other words, the existence of a rate of interest, which is the originary rate. But how does this then work itself out in the market? Well, of course, in the market, there would have to be exchange based upon this preference that people have of time. Every market, of course, is based upon people's preferences. They demand and supply things based upon what they prefer, and what they prefer more, and what they prefer less. So we can have a time market, just like we have a market for cars or shoes or capital goods, etc. And in this time market, we have the exchange of present money for future money. Now, money is used in the time market for the precise reason that money is used in all exchange. It's the medium of exchange. Or to put it in slightly different words, it's the preeminent present good. If I want to borrow present goods in a market, then what I want to borrow is money. What I would prefer to borrow is money, as opposed to, say, borrowing a car or borrowing a house. Because those goods, of course, are not generally saleable. They're not the preeminent present good. Okay, all exchange, as we've said before, is based upon reverse preferences. In this case, of course, it's time preferences that are reversed, so to speak. We have demanders of present money who have higher time preference, and we have suppliers of present money who have lower time preference. If there's some people with higher time preference, then obviously they're willing to pay higher premiums to acquire present money than the lower time preference people find necessary to lend to them in exchange. Somebody might be, like my example before, might be willing to pay $250 as a premium to borrow $1,000 from me today. I might be willing to lend this person $1,000 for only a $100 premium. My time preference obviously is low relative to the person who wants to borrow. So as long as people's time preferences differ, there's room for mutually beneficial trade. And just like in all markets, then this trade results in a price, the rate of interest, and the exhaustion, as we talked about in our very first lecture that I did on Monday, the exhaustion of mutual gain. That is, it's a market clearing price where demand and supply are the same. Now, we might just reiterate one point we made in that lecture about prices. We said that in the Austrian view, when we talk about the price of a good, we argue that this price is based or determined solely by subjective value. This is because both the supply and demand of the good are based upon subjective value. And so subjective value considerations determine both the price of the good by the interchange of demand and supply and the amount of it traded. If the subjective value of the good is greater, its demand would be greater, the price would be higher and the amount traded would be larger, right? We'd shift the demand curve out along the supply curve. Well, the same then is true in the time market. Time preference determines the rate of interest. This is because time preference is what is behind both sides of the market. People demand present money based upon their time preference. Other people supply present money based upon their time preference. And so both the rate of interest in the market and the amount of present money traded in the time market depends solely upon time preference. There's no other operating cause. Now, one might say, well, what about all the other conditions that seem to affect the market? Like, for example, again, to go back to pricing of goods. Why don't things like production costs or, other conditions that aren't subjective but objective, of people's incomes or something like this, affect the price of the good? Well, they do affect the price of the good, perhaps. But they affect the price of the good, whatever these objective conditions are that affect the price of the good, they do so only through subjective valuation. If I have more income and therefore I demand more, it's only through subjective valuation of that additional income that I demand more. So we're not saying, of course, that we can't come up with a laundry list of possible objective elements or factors that would affect the price of a good. Oil price is affected because a whole bunch of refineries all of a sudden burn to the ground. And so in recognition of this greater scarcity, speculators immediately bid the price of the oil up. Okay, so it's seemingly an objective factor here affecting things. But that's not quite right, at least not in the Austrian view. This objective factor has to be, so to speak, filtered through people's subjective valuations, right? That's how it then affects the price. Maybe the price wouldn't be affected at all if people subjectively value the oil differently. So the same thing then, this kind of analysis is done in the time market. Are there objective conditions that exist in the world that affect the interest rate? Well, sure. Our argument is that they only do this through time preference. That's the filter through which all of these objective factors bear upon the market. The interest rate only moves when either the demand or the supply for present money changes. And the demand and supply of present money change only when people's subjective valuations of these objective conditions change. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say that the interest rate is determined by time preference. Now, maybe I should add here, I don't intend in this lecture, because there's too much to cover of greater importance, to talk about the other elements of the market rate of interest, like, say, risk of default or inflation premiums or entrepreneurial elements or things like that. Okay, I'm waiving those considerations and sticking just with this originary interest element in the market rate of interest. Okay, so if you want those complicating factors, you can read the expositions of this in Human Action or Man, Economy, and State, etc. Now, furthermore, there are two components of the time market. The first of these is the credit market. And the credit market is where the exchange of present money for future money is not consummated, is not completed until the future period. The person who obtains present money engages in a contractual obligation to pay future money back to the lender at some specified period of time. So you notice then that the exchange itself is not completed until the future. That's why we call it a credit transaction. So a credit transaction is one that's not even completed until the future. Part of it takes place in the present, the other part in the future. Now in the credit market then there are two subcomponents and numerous subcomponents of these. There's the consumer loan market. And then under this heading we would have things like the mortgage loan market, the auto loan market, credit card market, so on and so forth. So there are consumer loans that are made. Obviously the money that's borrowed here is used to buy consumer goods. And then there's a producer loan market where the money that's borrowed is used to purchase capital goods. And again, there would be various substrata of these. AAA corporate bond, BB, high yield bonds, so on and so forth. Then the second part of the time market we've talked about already at some length. This is the production structure. So the production structure is also part of the time market. This is not a credit transaction that takes place in the production structure. As we've spoken about before, what happens here is that capitalist entrepreneur lends money to factor owners at the beginning of production and all through the production process. This is a cash market, the labor market, the market for capital goods and raw materials and so on. And then the capitalist entrepreneur receives future money when the output he produces is sold. So this is not part of the credit market, but it is part of the time market. It's two cash markets. The cash market for factors of production in the present, the cash market for the output in the future. And as we spoke about before, the capitalist entrepreneur, in order to engage in production, must earn an interest rate. He must be able, because of his time preference, to earn a premium on the present money that he puts into the production process. And again, we've spoken about this at some length. What he earns, or the way in which he earns this, is to pay the discounted marginal value product to the factors and then receive the full marginal value product when he sells the output. So he receives a price spread between the prices he pays for the factors and the prices he receives for the output. Now, furthermore, we know that across the strata of these elements of the time market, the originary rate of interest is the same. This will happen because of arbitrage. So if it were possible for a capitalist to invest in some processes where originary interest was higher, let's say 10%, than it was in another process where the originary rate was only 5%, capitalists would rush to lend where the rate was 10. Remember again that my assumption is I'm assuming away all the factors of risk and all the complicating factors, etc. So capitalists will always arbitrage present money to where its value is the highest. But of course, as the arbitrage process occurs, as money is taken away from low interest areas and put into high interest areas, the supply of present money in the high interest area pushes the rate down there, and the withdrawal of the supply of present money in the low interest market pushes the rate up there until they come into equality. And so we would expect that on the market there's a tendency for the originary rate of interest to be the same everywhere. Or to put this in different terms, the interest rate in a market economy is not set in the credit markets. This is the way you typically see interest rate determination presented in a textbook. We have a credit market, right? We have a saving, the supply of present money, and we have the demand for this present money that's based mainly upon producers, but consumers could enter in as well. And the market rate of interest then is set by the interplay of demand and supply for credit. This is just wrong. The market rate of interest, the originary component of the market rate of interest, is set by supply and demand for present money throughout the time market. And perhaps the greatest part of the time market is the structure of production. This might quantitatively be a much larger part of the time market than the credit market. We also know through this analysis, since the originary interest is the same across all components of the time market and all components of the production structure, all subcomponents there, that this price spread that's earned by the capitalist when he invests in production processes and this interest rate is the same regardless of the production process. The same interest rate, in other words, is applied uniformly to all production processes, to all factors of production in every production process in the economy. The same discount rate is applied across the whole economy. So each factor has its own rental price. That rental price depending upon its marginal productivity and the value of the output it produces, as we discussed this morning. And that would be unique to that factor, or at least unique to that class of factor. But the interest rate, the discount rate that is applied, applies to all factors the same. Again, you can clearly see from this argument that you cannot treat the interest rate as a factor payment. The interest rate is everywhere the same in the economy. It isn't related to factor productivity. It's what discounts factor productivity. And it's uniform across all factors of production. Unlike, again, other factors that have their own relatively unique factor price, rental price. Now, let's turn to what we might call the interest rate problem, and see how in the literature we would deal with what boehm-bawerk called the interest rate problem. How this has been dealt with by various schools of thought. The interest rate problem is this. The price of a capital good in the market is not bid up to be equal to the stream of its marginal value products over its life. There's a surplus of income, we might call it, that accrues to capital. You can pay less for a capital good to own it today than the sum of the marginal value products the capital good generates over its lifetime. Now, why is this so? What explains this premium? Now, as we've spoken about already, you can see the explanation that we give in the Austrian School is time preference. It's a very straightforward explanation. It seems to be perfectly reasonable. This was the view of Mises, Frank Fetter, the great American Austrian economist, and Murray Rothbard. So the mere fact that there is a preference that individuals have to attain in sooner instead of later implies this premium of the present or the discount of the future, and then directly then explains why it is that capital goods prices today are not bid up to the full value of the marginal value products the capital generates in the future. It should be also pointed out that time preference explains all manifestations of interest, whether they relate to production elements in the economy or not. That is, time preference explains the interest rate on consumer loans, where obviously productivity couldn't enter into the explanation at all. Productivity of the factor could only enter into the explanation in the producer loan market or into the structure of production. And we finally might say, in this view of time preference, interest income that the capitalist earns by investing his funds in the production process up front and then receiving the full marginal value product stream in the future is paid for the service of advancing someone in time toward his end. So the capitalist, by lending money in the present, is able to advance the borrower toward his end in time. I want to buy a new car. And in order for me to save up money to buy a new car, it might take 2 years. But if a capitalist lends to me, then I'm in a position to immediately satisfy my end. And that is, so to speak, the benefit of the service that the capitalist provides. So that's one answer. That's the Austrian answer. Another answer that's been given in the literature, which I won't take time to dwell on because it's antiquated, is the exploitation of the worker. That all net income, all gross profit that accrues to the capitalist entrepreneur does so because there's exploitation of the worker. The worker is paid a lower value than he generates in production simply because the capitalist is in a superior bargaining position or some other such argument. So we can easily, again, dispense with that. The third is the productivity of capital. And this is a much more popular explanation in the economic literature in the 20th century and the 21st century than worker exploitation. The argument here is that capital gives a flow of productive services, and that interest is the manifestation of these productive services. Now, this still necessitates asking the question, why doesn't competition erode away the value of these flow of services? And the argument here in the productivity camp is that interest is not eroded away by competition. That is, entrepreneurs do not go into the market and competing against each other, bid up the value of the capital good to its full marginal value product in the future. They leave this interest payment simply because this productivity accrues to the owner of the capital. It accrues to the owner of capital regardless of what bidding goes on for the factor of production. It isn't related to the bidding of the factor of production. It simply always accrues to whoever owns the capital good. This is just a fact of property ownership. Now, we might split this productivity theory into two camps. There's what we might call the naive productivity theory. This is the one that boehm-bawerk demolished in his work in the 1890s. Here, the argument is that simply the physical fecundity of capital goods explains interest. So you have a capital good that has a marginal physical product, as we said before, and the mere fact that it generates this flow of productive services is sufficient to explain interest. Now, clearly, this is no good, right? This is why boehm-bawerk formulated the interest rate problem in the way that he did. He pointed out that the interest rate problem is a problem of value. It can't be conceived as a problem of productivity in the physical sense. It's a value productivity problem. So physical productivity has nothing to do with it. Physical productivity only explains the marginal physical product of the factor. It only relates to that, right? The value problem, though, relates to the value of this factor, the marginal value product of the factor, and the stream of this marginal value product over time. Why is there a difference between marginal value product and the price that's paid for the factor? See, so marginal physical product can't give us any explanation of this whatsoever. It's simply incapable. It misses the whole point of the interest rate problem itself. Now, another tact was taken. Once again, this is a common, relatively common device that leveled against the Austrian view of things. We can just prove that physical productivity generates income by example. Okay, so we don't have to depend upon this rather more naive view. Let's just give an example. And some very famous authors in the history of thought have done this. Frank Knight, Irving Fisher, Paul Samuelson have all offered these kinds of examples. Cruisonian plants and sheep herds and rice hordes. And all the examples go something like this. Let's assume that we have a capital stock. We have a herd of sheep, let's say, 100 sheep. This is Fisher's example. And the 100 sheep grow at a fixed rate into the future, just by physical fecundity. 100 sheep, at the end of a year you get 110. And every year thereafter you get a 10% increase. So capital stock grows at a fixed rate. And the second assumption in these examples is that the economy is a one-good economy. So the only existing good in the economy is sheep, or Cruisonian plants, or rice, or whatever it happens to be. Now, it's thought by these authors that by assuming that there's only one good in the economy, physical productivity and value productivity have to be the same. If you have 100 sheep today and you get 110 in a year, then it simply must be the case that you've earned a 10% real interest rate. There's a real return here, an interest income that's accruing to whoever owns the herd of sheep. Right? And it accrues to you every year. It can't be assigned to any factor of production, and it can't be eroded away by competition. Again, it's simply a fact of the ownership of the good itself, the ownership of the capital stock. Now, there are various criticisms we might level at this. The first is that the construction of this example, once again, misses the whole point. It doesn't really touch the question of the interest rate problem as we and boehm-bawerk have posed it. Because it isn't couched in value terms. It's couched only in the terms of physical productivity. Everybody knows that if you have a herd of sheep that grows at 10% per year, if you do nothing, you just leave them alone and they grow at 10%, then every year you'll have 10% more sheep. This is physical fecundity, right? Everybody knows that such things exist. But this doesn't relate to the value problem. Or we might put it this way. We might say that this income that accrues to the owner of the sheep herd isn't interest. It's simply the physical fecundity of the sheep herd. And that's it. It's not interest. Interest is the premium of the present or the discount of the future. Interest arises only because we can value the present differently from the future. Now, secondly, we might point out that this situation, this one good world, is, of course, precisely designed to prevent the value question from coming into the example. For one thing, it involves no trade. There are no prices for sheep, either in the present or the future. But what if we permit trade in sheep? Well, then if we permit trade in sheep, we'll see that 100 sheep today will not necessarily have the same trade value, exchange value, as 110 sheep in the future. What if, for example, in this system we find that the people who own these sheep herds and who have the option of trading them believe that at the end of 1 year the world will end. So their time preference is extremely high. Then will 100 sheep accrue into 110 at the end of a year? No. 100 sheep will be 0 at the end of a year, right? They'll consume these sheep fully. This is based solely upon time preference. You see, it's time preference that determines how the value of the physical fecundity will be done by the individual. And we can value the option of having 100 sheep today or 110 in the future differently depending upon our time preference. If, on the other hand, let's say our time preferences are very low, let's say we expect to, we want our capital stock to accumulate, we may decide to have our 100 sheep grow into 110 just by leaving them alone. Or we may decide to engage in capital accumulation techniques by which 100 sheep today grows into 120. Genetic engineering or something. Or we may, again, consume our capital. This just depends upon time preference. This, by the way, would even exist even if we didn't have trade. Let's say we just had Caruso on an island with 100 sheep. Even then, how he acts toward the sheep will not be in this mechanistic, I can have 100 sheep today or 110 in a year. If he thinks that the world is going to end in a year, or let's say better yet, he thinks he's going to be rescued in a year and get off the island, then he might just consume all the sheep. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't his time preference be very high in that circumstance? In other words, he would desire the present consumption. If, on the other hand, let's say he finds a wife and he gets married and he decides that maybe the future is more important now, maybe he'll start to develop these techniques of breeding his sheep where he gets, instead of 110, he gets 115. He'll engage in techniques of capital accumulation. So once again,